So I make a lot of videos over Windows tools, debloating Windows, all these different things about Windows I actually enjoy. There's portions of it where I'm like, hey, Windows does these things right, especially when it comes to gaming. That's what I really use Windows for. But what is the worst feature in Windows? And I've used Windows since Win 3.1.1, basically, from the DOS days, 95, 98, and up, and made an entire career out of it. But there's one feature that absolutely I refuse to use, period. It has always ended a disaster. It always ended with me going, I will never, ever, ever use this again. And that is the big thing here. What is that feature? And it's software RAID in Windows. You can see this by just right-clicking this, going into disk management, and typically what you can do is you can do a mirror, span, stripe, all with your devices. So if you had two identical disks, typically you could like add a mirror, or if you had 3 disks, you'd stripe it and do like what's called a software RAID. And software RAID has come a long ways, mind you. If you go back in time 10, 15 years, software RAID, no one used ever for practically anything. But times have changed. In Linux and BSD and a lot of other big systems, we actually use software RAID quite a bit, and it's very, very good. I would say a lot better than what it once was. It was always kind of like the redheaded stepchild. But I digress. I'm talking about software RAID in here, not the Linux realm or even BSD realm when you get like TrueNAS and other stuff. I absolutely love ZFS and other file systems. But when it comes to NFS and Windows software RAID, you cannot find anything worse. This right here, I've set up probably a handful of times, and every single time I had something happen, it would end up degrading it, meaning you'd lose a lot of performance. Or let's say if you don't have ECC memory, a lot of times you'd run into big problems with the drive, or all of a sudden you had to do like a hard reboot and then it would lose its sync, and then it would be sitting there churning out and rebuilding your RAID for like 5 days. So if you ever had like a power outage and you're using it without a UPS, obviously disaster is going to strike you. It's just a matter of time. There's a lot of big things that happen with Windows software RAID and why it's such a terrible feature. But I wanted to dive deeper into this because I think in recent years, people have forgotten of how terrible this feature is. So much so, I think a lot of the new and upcoming technicians, and I'm speaking to you guys out there that are maybe teenagers or in your 20s, and you're kind of beginning that IT career, and you're like, oh, well, software RAID's not bad. And you're right. It's just Windows software RAID is atrocious. And I will stand by this. I will die on this hill and tell anybody in the comments that disagrees with me, you are wrong and you just haven't had enough experience with Windows software RAID yet to really crap on it as much as I can. So let's go to the actual forums and see what people are saying. So here's one where they actually set up RAID 5 in Windows Server software RAID. If you're running Windows Server, this applies to you. Windows RAID, whether it's Windows 10, whether it's Windows Server, same thing, same. It's not very good. And this guy had a problem. He had the server crashed, and now it went black screen, is totally unresponsive, and the reboot caused the RAID array to start resyncing. What happens when a software RAID 5 starts resyncing? You lose a ton of performance. You can see performance hits as high as 60-70% of all performance lost and impacted. So there it goes. And then 2 days later, it crashed again. And then all of that resyncing progress has to restart yet again. See the problem here? This is really, really bad. Now, someone commented on this one. This is probably from not using ECC RAM. And if you're using ECC RAM, this will definitely help this not to happen. So if you are using software RAID, ECC RAM is recommended. Almost every residential box doesn't use ECC RAM. So very important to know. Highly recommend. Don't do this. It's so bad. So if you do software RAID at any point, I do recommend ECC RAM. But this is a good point here. But I go back and read through a lot of these things. Windows software RAID is still kind of like recommended by some folks, and that blows my mind. just completely blows my mind. Next one, this one was actually super user. We're going to server fault. And you might be thinking, why are you using this instead of like a software publication or maybe another YouTuber or something like that to compare on? And the reason being is, one, I want to show you real world actual usage cases, not theoretical. And when you get into the actual articles written about this or YouTubers that might use software RAID, a lot of times they just don't have the experience to actually speak on this. So I like to use these community posts to basically say, hey, here's other examples. I can tell you, hey, in my 20 years of actually doing this type of thing, and the handful of times I ever set up software RAID, it always ended in disaster. It always ended into, at the very least, performance issues, but at the most, data loss where I was restoring from backup. So here's this. This one actually is a case for software RAID. It says, hey, there's a few disadvantages, and most of these are valid. But again, he does not say don't use Windows Software RAID. That's one thing. It used to be, hey, use hardware RAID. And if you're already on Windows Server, definitely use hardware RAID. Again, hardware RAID I still would recommend based on most system setups for Windows. But again, it just depends on what hardware you're running in the background. And most big businesses these days are all using virtualization, and it's a ZFS type setup, usually in a data center somewhere. So this doesn't really apply too much. But let's move on. This is one case where it was like, hey, I actually recommend RAID. And I was like, that's interesting. Obviously, only 5 upvotes here, but still. Yeesh. So moving on, I started getting to the forums here. This is actually an Ars Technica forum, but a lot of people here actually recommended it again. And I was just like, why are people recommending Windows Software RAID? And I think some of the rationale behind this was if hardware RAID fails, you have to have, I've had a RAID controller fail on me, and you have to have that identical hardware to replace that RAID controller so you have that ability, which is pretty cool, pretty important to know. But with software RAID, you could actually, in theory, take those disks and put them elsewhere. Now, I've never had a successful move of Windows Software RAID to another system, but I have had a successful move of software RAID both in BetterFS and Linux, and then also FreeNAS or TrueNAS, whatever you want to call it these days, with ZFS. I've moved that to different hardware as well successfully. So those are 2 examples of software RAID working. But again, Windows has never been in the working portion for me when it comes to software RAID. And then finally, I kind of want to add this in, because Reddit in the sysadmin forums, I really like Reddit for what it is. It's good feedback, and the sysadmins forum is actually pretty good. I really like to kind of come here and see what people are recommending or doing. This is obviously a very old post, but still relevant today. And this one from Disclosure 5 was actually very, very exactly what basically I've been saying. ZFS on Linux is entirely proven. 7 years ago, actually, that was a little bit tricky to set up, but ZFS is a very good software RAID platform because you can take those pools, you can resilver them, you can do a lot of really cool stuff with them, but RAID 5 on Windows is not. Again, anytime you have a hard power outage, you have anything like that, it can end in absolute disaster. And kind of reading through this thread was really interesting to see what other people's experiences were. But yeah, it's like software RAID being inferior to hardware RAID is an antiquated point of view. True, but I should expand on this. It depends on the situation and performance requires of the RAID array. And this, I think, is someone that's using ZFS on Linux or using any other software platform that's not Windows. But you do still have a lot of back and forth here. Like this guy right here is saying, hey, software RAID has outperformed all but the most expensive hardware for RAID for over a decade. a lot of keyboard cowboys out there. So that's kind of what I'm seeing over there. Obviously, it's funny to see this back and forth, and it's something that's a little bit divisive, but something that I kind of want to touch on and kind of throw my hat in the ring here. I will say, and reiterated it kind of throughout this entire thing, software RAID can be good in Linux. It can be good in like BSD or using ZFS or even BetterFS. BetterFS less, though. I still like ZFS the best. But please do not use Windows Software RAID. It's absolutely terrible and the worst feature of Windows. You will have heartache in your future. Use it for any long period of time, and I guarantee you, you will agree with me. But with that said, let the floodgates open. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Come at me, bro, if you like Windows Software Raid, because I will disagree with you every single step of the way. There's nothing you could say to change my mind here based on my experiences. So, with that, I'll see you in the next one.